Four men. Four men. I want to tell you about four men this morning. Take a deep breath and share with you about four men. The first man, Robert Branch, my paternal great-great-grandfather, was born in January, probably a day just like this January day. I don't know which day in January, but he was born in January of 1835. 1835. In the southeastern portion of Chesterfield County, Virginia, in a town called Bermuda Hundred. Bermuda Hundred. And 100, I don't know if y'all know this, but 100 is a space of land that would fit 100 households. So it was a parcel of land that would fit 100 households, and they would call that whole section 100. So he was born in a town called Bermuda Hundred, which was the first incorporated town in the English colony of Virginia in the year 1614. So Robert Branch, 1835, my paternal great-great-grandfather. He grew up, he married Louisa, and in 1873 fathered a son, Edward Branch, who was my great-grandfather. And he is the oldest relative that I actually have a photograph of, Edward Branch, who was born in 1873. In 1898, Edward Branch, my great-grandfather, married Frances Yates, and in 1907 fathered James Major Branch, my grandfather. James Major Branch. James Major Branch grew up, and in 1935 fathered a son, Robert Lee Branch, who is my father. So the two men I want to talk about, two of the four, are Robert Branch, born in 1835, and 100 years later, also in January, his great-grandson, Robert Lee Branch, was born. So those are two of the four men that I want to tell you about, both Roberts. One my great-great-grandfather and one my father. John Wesley Kimbrough is the third man I want to tell you about. That's my maternal great-grandfather. Was born, guess when? January 28th.
Oh, wow.
That's what I'm telling you, because I got I got one January brother with me today, so I'm telling you about all these January babies. John Wesley Kimbrough, my maternal great-grandfather, was born on January 28th, 1878, in Sunflower County, Mississippi. Sunflower County, Mississippi, which is located in the Mississippi Delta region of that state. Many, particularly African Americans, came up to the Delta region to work, and I'm sure his family was part of that. John Wesley Kimbrough. So John Wesley Kimbrough grew up, married Emma, and in 1901 fathered a son, Otto Wesley Kimbrough, my grandfather. O-T-T-O, Otto Wesley Kimbrough, my grandfather. Otto grew up, married Clara, and in 1935 fathered a daughter, Clara Kimbrough, who is my mother. So John Wesley Kimbrough, my great-grandfather, and Otto Wesley Kimbrough are the third and fourth men that I'm talking about this morning. So that's four men. I greet you in the name of those four men whose names I carry. Robert Branch, my paternal great-great-grandfather. Robert Lee Branch, my father. John Wesley Kimbrough, my maternal great-grandfather. And Otto Wesley Kimbrough, my grandfather. I carry their names. I'm Robert Wesley Branch. Two of the names one name comes from my father's side of the family, Robert, and Wesley comes from my mother's side of the family, Kimbrough. So I give thanks for their lives today. I give thanks for them. Only one of those men is alive today, and that's my father, whose birthday is January 9th, just next week. So I give thanks for all of those lives today, all of their stories, known and unknown. I know a lot about some of those men and not so much about others, but I'm grateful for their stories. I'm grateful for their blood, which runs through my veins even as we speak right now. They are my elders and my ancestors, and they stand with me in this hour. So I thank you, each and every one of you, for the life, literally, that you gave me and that you continue to give me in this journey. So I greet you in the name of those 4 men today. And I want to welcome you to our program, welcome to our space, welcome to our conversation. I appreciate you being here. I appreciate me being here. I'm glad that I'm here, because when I think about those brothers and all the sacrifices that they made so that I could sit in this house on this day, in this space with you, that's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that have gone into making that happen. That's a lot. That's a lot of energy. That's a lot of dreams, a lot of deferred dreams, and a lot of completely unfulfilled dreams. When I think of Robert Branch being born in 1835, Bermuda Hundred was known as a tobacco-producing town because of the plantations that surrounded the county. Many people know Chesterfield County, Virginia, for a lot of things, and one of them was tobacco production. And so when I think of my great-great-grandfather being born into that town at that time, I can only imagine what his life and his aspirations were like. And I know that he can see all of this bloodline later, what his life contributed in mine, because, you know, the ancestors know everything at this point, but I can only imagine, really, and fantasize and just speculate on what his life must have been like, because it, no doubt, was very, very different from the life that I lead today. So I appreciate those brothers. I appreciate my father, who's still here, who can continue that legacy in a very living way with all of his family members. I have an Uncle Ned Branch in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, who is 100 years old. He is the oldest of 10 children.
Wow,
he is the oldest. Awesome. Uncle Ned is the oldest of 10 children, and he survived all of his brothers and sisters, and he is still alive to this day. He never drank. He never smoked. His wife died when he was in his 80s, and he got married again.
Wow.
He was married to his wife for like 60, 70-some years, and got married again when she died in his late 80s, and is married to this day. Walks every morning, a half a mile every morning with a walker, goes out and walks every morning. And he's 100 years old. I'm telling you, you can live your life any way you want if you just set it up that way. And you can be here as long, this was not what I was going to talk about, but I just want to say it. You can be here as long as you want to be. And if you want to use the Bible to back you up on that, just read Genesis very carefully, because God promised you 120 years. Promised you 120 years. That's a promise. Now, you can take it or leave it. You don't have to have it. But if you want it, there's scriptural authority for you living to be 120 years. God said, I will limit their lives to 120. Go back and study the patriarchs who died at age 120, and you'll see it's all in there. So that's just a little benefit if you're interested in that. But we are promised long life. What did the Bible say about Moses? When he died, his life, there was no dimming of his eye, nor was his strength dissipated. He was strong and alert when he went to be with the Lord. So it's all in what you want, and it's all in what you want to create in your life. And Uncle Ned is going long and strong at 100. This is exactly the conversation that I want to have today, taking advantage of. All the boys are here today. No girls here today. This is the brothers-only conversation. And so I appreciate it. Right. Also, I want to give, before we get too deep into this and I forget, because, once the train leaves the station, I'm not liable to remember some of the things. It's gone, yeah. But I want to give a shout-out to Brother Jamal who is a new friend of the show, who I've been talking to a lot this week, and he's writing a book about his spiritual journey, and we're going to have a conversation soon about it, and I'm just happy that our paths have crossed. I appreciate you, brother, and I appreciate the energy that you bring into my life, and I thank you for respecting and honoring and celebrating and sharing the work that we do here. I really appreciate that. So thank you. Shout out to you. This is first time listening live, so I appreciate you for that. The men in our families, that's what I want to talk about. The men in our families. And some of it's good, and some of it's not so good. Some of it's good, and some of it's not so good. You know, and I want to talk about all of it this morning, because this is the perspective from which I need to ask a question before I make this statement. So, Brother Kwesi, do you have children?
I have a son. That I do.
Oh, okay, good, because I didn't want to assume. I did not know that. Okay. So then what I was going to say, thank you, God, for letting me pause and listen inwardly. What I was going to say is that we are having this conversation from the perspective of men who do not have children. But the truth is that Dante and I are having this conversation from the perspective of men who do not have children. Brother Kwesi has a child, so that's even more texture that we'll be able to get from this, because many times when we talk about the men in our family, if we're talking about men in our family, particularly men who have gone on before us, many of them our fathers, because if they weren't, we wouldn't be here. So it's interesting when you talk about that part of a man's life when you do not share that part of a man's life. So my perspective on my father and grandfather and great-grandfathers will no doubt shift when and if I become a father in my life. You just know more. You see it from a different lens. Right now I can only discuss it from the lens of someone who is not a father himself. So that said, I do want to talk about the brothers in the family and the legacy of brothers in the family and what we see as we look out on that landscape. Because what I do know about the four men that I just told you about, some of it is not so great. Some of it is not so great. And I can see in my family, in that line, and I'll start with James Major Branch, who is my father's father. I've heard my father tell stories of how his father was not there for him. I need to be careful how I talk about this. My grandfather and my grandmother had 3 children together. My father was one of them. And my grandmother had other sets of children with other men. And so the life that my mother and father have, having been married for 51 years, is not a life that my grandfather had with my grandmother. Okay? I'll put it like that. They did not share that kind of family life, although they had 3 children together. And so my father has told stories of his father being physically and emotionally and spiritually absent from his life. And I can see the impact and the damage of that has had on my father. I can see that. So much so, and I'm glad I brought up Uncle Ned, because my father looks at his Uncle Ned as a father. And T.D. Jakes taught me this, that just because you're a grown man, that doesn't mean you stop needing a father.
Oh, that's true. That's really good.
All right? That doesn't mean that you stop needing a father because you become a grown man. And so even a 78-year-old man like my father needs a father. Every man needs somebody, an elder, that he can look up to, draw sustenance from, and probably the most important thing when you look at our culture, be held accountable to for his behavior. No matter how old you are. Because if a lot of these men out here creating the kind of lives that they're creating, if they were accountable to another man for what they're creating, it would change some of the energy out here in the space and in the community. So many men, like my father, are in their 70s or advanced age of life, and there are no men there for them. There are peers, But I'm talking about an elder who you're held accountable to. Now, we all know, and this goes without saying, or maybe it should go without saying in this conversation because this is a spiritual space, we all know that we have our Heavenly Father. And no matter who you have on earth, you always have a Heavenly Father that you can turn to. So I'm putting that on the table so that we all know that that's a given in this conversation.
Right.
Okay. If you want to make it a little bit more complex, I did not, and again, I want to be very careful and sensitive about how I talk about this, but I do want to share what has been my truth in my life. I did not grow up in a household, and I would really like to hear your comments on this, Dante, because my perception is that you did. I did not grow up in a household where I looked at my father as the spiritual head of the household. Was he the physical provider of our household? Absolutely. Very clear about that. Did I look to him for spiritual sustenance, to carry the spiritual vision and burden of the family? Because he's not really into it like that. I don't know what his spiritual, the depth of his spiritual calling is, because no one can really know that about someone else, really. That's between them and God. But I know that it's not something that is professed in a way that would be a shepherd herding a flock, and so I did not look and do not look to my father for that kind of spiritual sustenance. I'm interested and curious for those who've had a different experience. And Dante, I know your father is a minister of the gospel, so my perception is that you probably have a different experience than what I've had.
Yeah, my experience is my dad would probably be who you are in terms of he did not get that type of support. His father was not there. My grandmother and my biological grandfather separated at a young age for specific reasons, and my grandfather was absent in his life. So there was a stepfather that was there, but he was not spiritually there. So my father made a conscious decision. He did not want that for whenever he had children. Mm-hmm. So he made it his business. He did not want that cycle to be repeated and to basically kind of make up for what he did not get. So he did provide that spiritual guidance and to make sure he was physically there. And even to this day, he is, I'm almost 40. My sister and my brother, they're in their early 30s. My baby sister's 25. And he is still, makes it his business to make sure that he is providing guidance spiritually as well as physically. And his motivation is because he did not get that growing up.
So what we're talking about, and that was beautifully expressed, what you just described is a spiritual head of household, okay? That's very important. And when the Bible talks about women submitting to their men, that's what they're talking about, submitting to the spiritual head of the household, all right? Not just because he's a man, but because he's the actual spiritual head of the marital unit. And that's a very specific thing. Couple of things I want to put into this space as we go deeper into this conversation. None of what I'm discussing, and I think this holds true I know it holds true for the three brothers that are here. None of what we're discussing is a judgment on our fathers or uncles or brothers or cousins or any males in our family. None of these points that we're bringing up are judgments. Some of them, they're all facts. They are all our experience, but they're not judgments. We're just looking at the facts of our experience, making sense of it, dissecting it, and using our own experiences to talk about some of the larger issues that are universal to all men, particularly African-American men, because that's what all three of us are. So I want to say that very clearly. I also want to make a distinction between, and I did this in my opening comments, between spiritually present, physically present, and emotionally present, okay? Because what Dante just described is a father who grew up without his biological father physically present. Is that what I heard you say?
Right.
Okay. And was also spiritually absent because he wasn't physically there, perhaps. I grew up in a household with a father who was physically present He was physically there and provided for our family without fail. He was many times emotionally absent, and many times spiritually absent. And in days past, it has been difficult for me, in my experience, to have conversations with brothers about this, because the first thing they will say, well, at least your father was there, and that's true. That's why I want to be very clear about the filters that we're using to talk about this, because I am grateful that my father was and is there. Was and is. Very grateful. And so now we're looking at what that was. The last thing I want to say before we go deeper, too, is that when you're a child and you're a little boy, and the Bible speaks to this, too, you see your life through the eyes of a child. I'm not a child. I'm not even a little boy anymore. I'm not even a young boy. I am a grown-ass man. And so I see my life and my experience now very differently than I did when I was a child. Had I had this conversation 20 years ago, it would have been full of judgments. But now that I understand more of what it's like to be a man and to live my life as a man and all that that means, I get it. It has softened my heart to a lot of the things that we're talking about here. I get it. And when I have children, I'll really get it on a whole other level. You know, it just will soften your heart and bring new awarenesses. So I'm not having this conversation. I hope not to have this conversation. And if I become conscious during it that I'm having it as a wounded child, I'll try to catch myself and speak on it. But really, I'm having this conversation as a grown man who is looking at the men in the family and making some decisions about what I will allow into my life moving forward and what I will not. I want to tell you about a cousin who has a 16-year-old son. And my cousin is physically absent, emotionally absent, and spiritually absent from his son's life. His son was conceived during a one-night stand. And while my cousin does acknowledge that he does have a son, you could say Happy Father's Day to him on Father's Day, and he will look at you like you are talking to Bozo the Clown. Like, what? There's such a detachment from being a father. No connection. Doesn't see his son, doesn't talk to him, doesn't ask anybody who has seen him or talked to him about him. Nothing. That's inconceivable to me. I can't even fathom that. But again, I'm not a father, so maybe it's something that I don't get. But I look out into the world at all the men who are making babies and who can turn their backs on them seemingly without pause, without any kind of internal consternation. So I want to ask the question and talk about what is that we do as men whenever we become fathers. Where is that coming from in the soul space? What is that? Where is that coming from in the soul space when someone like my cousin can completely just turn his back on his son and act like the brother doesn't even exist? And this brother is 16 years old now, growing up without a father.
The interesting thing is, at least from my perception, and my perspective, is the strongest spiritual being as a child was really my grandfather, and then a few years after I was born, he died. And so my father wasn't there, and I was raised by a stepfather who I saw read the Bible, quote the Bible all the time, but was one of the most abusive persons I have ever encountered in my life. Spiritually abusive, physically abusive, mentally, even sexually abusive. But this was the beginning of my life, and this is who I was raised under for years. And getting, as from the perspective of being a man or a young man, what spirituality was supposed to be like. Thank God for my uncles and pastors, mentors, etc., that kind of corrected some of that thinking. But I had that question about my biological father for years. What is it about me that you refuse to come forth and to be present in my life. What is it about, and I carried this thing, this burden, this heaviness for years, thinking something was wrong with me. When I was 23 years old, I went to meet my paternal grandmother for the first time. I called her, got her information, called her, told her I was in college. No, I was leaving college. And I called her and I said, I'm on my way to meet you. We talked over the phone, and she said, ironically, your father is here. He's never here, but he's here. Would you like to speak to him? So I spoke to him and okay, whatever. So I spoke to him. My intention was to meet her, but because I knew he was going to be there, I was going to let him have it as soon as, on site, as soon as I saw him. We traveled up to Columbus, Ohio. I went to meet them, and as I went to speak to my father, he said, listen, I know you have a lot of questions, and I know that you are upset, but I'm praying that we can let the past be the past. And what I found out is this, a story that my mother told me from day one, dealing with the fact that on the day that I was born, January 2nd, 1977, she called my father. She was going into labor. She said, I'm going to the hospital. And she always told me my father just never showed up ever again, right? So that's starting the hurt. That was the story I always was given. On that day, when I met with my grandmother, met my father, he said to me, this is true because my mother backed it up. After I called her and told her I was there in Columbus. The story ends with my mother going back and being with my sister's father, and she cut my father out of the picture. So by the time I had my stepfather there, my mother got with my stepfather, my father was completely removed from the picture. So somehow, emotionally and everything, he removed himself from me. Now, I do think he has some responsibility to say, look, you're not going to cut me out of my son's life. But my mother played a big role in that. And to this day, I talk to my father. We have very good conversations, but there's still no emotional attachment. I dare to say with your cousin, and this is not judgment, and I don't know this for sure, I dare to say something has happened, and it could have been traumatic for him as to why he has removed himself emotionally, spiritually from his son.
Well, I can confirm that for you right now. My mother and I were talking about this on Christmas Day, actually. We sat at the kitchen table. I love these moments. My mother and I just sit at the kitchen table, and it all just comes out. We just talked about it. All right, and that's exactly what we did. She was drinking her tea. I was eating all those cookies that she made me, and we just talked. And my cousin, and again, I have to be very careful how I talk about this. My cousin grew up without a father in his life. My cousin was pretty much raised by my mother. He is the son of my mother's sister. And my mother's sister was out being young and carefree and doing her thing and kind of left the baby at home with her sister and her mother and my grandfather, Otto Wesley, in that household. This is where my cousin was raised in, that household. And my mother took care of him, so much so that when my mother got married, he was 16 when my mother got married to my father and moved from Pittsburgh to Washington, and he cried like a baby and begged my mother to bring him with her, which she said to him, as soon as you get out of high school, you can come live with me. He got out of high school, he packed his stuff and moved to Washington and lived with us. So I grew up with this cousin as like another brother. Wow. He lived in our house. So my father and mother are like his parents. So to answer your question, Brother Quasey, even though he grew up in our household like a brother, and my father was a father figure to him, in his heart space, he still is absent a father. Because the same questions are being asked. You asked the question very profound. Brothers out there, listen very carefully to what Brother Quasey said. What is it about me that makes this man want to have nothing to do with me? And that's what Brother Quasey was asking to a father who was physically absent. What I'm putting on the table is that I asked the same questions about a man that I saw every single day. Let that sink in. Let that sink in. Because you can be physically present and emotionally absent. And you can be you can be physically absent and still be emotionally present in your child's life.
Yes, indeed.
That's true. Yes, indeed. And to your point, my early years, or there was a point where I had an emotional disconnect with my father, even though he was physically there. And in my viewpoint, it seemed like he was emotionally there for my brother and my sister, and I couldn't understand what, okay, yes, he's here, but he seems to be more connected to them, and I had a resentment for a long period of time until when I got older, I was able to hash out and deal with those particular things specifically. So I can honestly say that there could be a time where there's a transition, where there at one point there is that person, that father is there physically and emotionally, then something happens where there's a disconnect, and then there can be a reconnection, or sometimes that connection is totally lost, whether it's physically or emotionally.
All right, now I love that. Let's talk about the transition, because one aspect of the transition, when you are a boy, even a young man, and spiritually immature in some sense, and this is just humanity and biology, you will ask the exact question that Brother Kwesi and I asked, and even Dante may have asked, well, what is it about me that my father is not really connecting to? Now, when you become a man, when you transition from boyhood to manhood, and as you move from spiritual immaturity into spiritual maturity, you begin to ask, well, what is it about my father that doesn't allow him to connect to his
seed? Exactly.
That's the transition. You stop blaming yourself, and you begin to look at this man and go, what is going on in your soul that you don't connect with your own child? You begin to look at them and examine and study, where are the voids? You begin to dig more deeply into their background and try to understand how this happened, and you take responsibility in a way that you don't when you're a child. And that's what we're talking about now.
To your point, I got my healing when I started researching my father's background on his father, his relationship. And that was around college when I began to reach out to his biological father and siblings in Chicago. My father was born in Mississippi, raised in Florida, but he never had a relationship. I think he may have seen him once or twice in his life.
Let's stop there for a minute, because I want to let that sink in. Your father may have seen his biological father once or twice in his life. Is that what you just said?
Yes.
That's deep, brothers. That's deep.
Yeah, that's major.
Deep. That's major.
Absolutely.
That's deep.
So, well, okay, let me retract that. After about 6 months, because they were born, he was about 6 months old, and then that's when my grandmother and grandfather left. So, but there's no memories, for him. So as far as he's concerned, it was once or twice. So let me make sure I'm clear on that.
But
when I began to, I just wanted to be
factually accurate. Yeah, got you.
Yeah. So, but when I began to understand that dynamic, then I began to understand I had my whole attitude changed on certain things, and then I was able to have a conversation, which was an uncomfortable conversation for him, because that meant he had to start dealing with some things that he basically had bottled up himself. Because basically the way I was responding to him was basically how he wanted to respond to his father. And as opposed to my other siblings, they weren't responding in that particular manner. So in a lot of ways, my action to him was reminding him of the reaction that he wanted with his father. And there was a time period he couldn't handle that.
And to make this extra deep and spiritual, that's part of the reason why you were born, the first son, to help your father heal some of his emotional trauma from his childhood. That's part of the reason why you were there. You just said it. I was responding to him in a way that my other brothers and sisters weren't. See, you were the chosen child to help him to face some of the stuff. And it took a certain amount of spiritual sustenance and substance in the child to help the parent see that. And I'm convinced parents can see in their children some things that remind them of themselves. And some of that distance was because some of what your father saw and what my father saw in us reminded them of their childhood scars and their own issues, some of which are so deep, Dante, we may never, ever, ever know some of the scars that our fathers had.
And let me just say, this is so true. I have been meaning to have this conversation with my father, and I just haven't. But my father, whatever happened between him and his father was so deep that when his father passed, not only did my father not attend his service, some of his brothers weren't there either. Now, all of the daughters were there, and they talked very highly of my grandfather, and, you know, the grandchildren talked very highly of my grandfather, but my father was absent, and it disturbed me because I'm like, why isn't he here? Why didn't he show up to bury his father? So I know that there's some deep things there, and I've been meaning to have some conversation. But you know how it is with your parents; you tread lightly, and it's very careful how you open that can of worms. So, but I know now after having this conversation, I'm definitely going to call him and have some conversations with him about that, because there's something there. It's something that happened, and I won't rest. I need some peace, and I need to understand. Maybe that's some of the answers, I guess, to why he's not present emotionally,
whatever the
in my life.
details are, and what I hear you saying is that you would like to know those details. Whatever the details are of your father's relationship with his father, and my father's relationship with his father, and Dante's father's relationship with his father, whatever the details are, when you hit the equal sign, it all added up to a brokenness in our fathers.
Oh, I'm sure.
It all added up to a brokenness. And
that brokenness also caused brokenness in our lives. It's almost like a ripple effect. Thank God we're healing, or we have healed some, I would say healing from it, but it has also caused some brokenness in our lives. And I pray that I do not pass that to my son, and that you all will not pass that to your children as well.
I want to share this one story just to really make it clear. I don't even really have to share it because I already know that the men who are listening, particularly if they're African-American men, they know exactly what we're talking about. This thing right here that we got our fingers on today is epidemic in our community. It is epidemic. The disconnect between fathers and their sons is epidemic in our community in all of these layers: physically present, emotionally present, spiritually present. Let me share this story. My father always talks about this. And the way that he shares it, when I was a boy and I would hear him share this story, he almost shared it in a way of, I don't know, it was almost as a part of a comedy routine. And I probably received it that way as a youngster, but now as a grown man, I realize how sad and tragic it is. My parents grew up in Pittsburgh, in a steel mill town, a.k.a. Pittsburgh Steelers. They grew up in a steel mill town. And so many people, the industry there was the mill, the steel mill. So even though my father's father, James Major Branch, who was one of the men I talked about earlier, even though he was not in a household with my father and his mother, he was in town. So my father would see him, he knew where he worked, and he went down to the steel mill one day to ask his father for some money. And his father denied him, not only denied him the money, but acted like he wasn't even there. Just completely shooed him like a fly. Just shoot. Just get away from me. And that is painful for me as a son to even listen to be denied by your father like that. Not just the money, but your very presence being denied. Now, I have felt that way many times with my father, but to hear him talk about that helped me as a man to understand the substance of his heart. Because when you're denied by your father like that, there is a piece of you that has to cut yourself off from any expectation of that relationship. You do it for survival. You do it for survival. And so you can go years and years and years with that part of your heart being cut off. And it doesn't necessarily, for some men, just cut back on because you have a child yourself. That's not an automatic.
That is true.
Okay?
Absolutely.
It's not an automatic.
That's true.
It's not automatic. So what you did to protect yourself on one hand and at one point in your life can be used to harm unwittingly and unknowingly, harm the people that you love on the other hand at a later point in your life. And that's what I began to understand, that in some sense my father couldn't give me what was never given to him.
And you don't know that until once you become a man and see it through a different perspective. You're looking at through a child's perspective as far as there's something wrong with me, why isn't he giving me this? Because especially when you see it everywhere else. And so then you're wondering and internalizing, why aren't I receiving the same thing? And you make a very valid point as far as being the oldest of 4 kids. I was basically the transition, if you will, for my dad to be the type of father that he is. And even you saying that just clicked and said, well, okay, I didn't put in those particular words in that connotation, but now it all makes sense. Yep. You know, my father and we have a great relationship now, but it wasn't, like I said, it wasn't like it was there, it was good, but there was a disconnect until I gravitated that. And it got at its point when, as I said, when I reached out to my biological father, and for a while there was a small resentment from him toward me, and I couldn't understand that. I'm like, you know, what? Why am I feeling this? And as I got, you know, further into it, it was because I was starting to do what he wanted, but he had pride, he had anger, and because I didn't have that baggage to deal with, I was able to do that. And during the course before my grandfather passed, I was encouraging that you need to reach out to him, you need to talk to him, you need to, you need some closure for yourself. And unfortunately, it didn't happen. You know, he kept putting it off and putting it off until my grandfather got ill, and then he passed away before he got a chance to resolve those issues, because he had to muster up things that he wanted to deal with and finally have a conversation with. So he lost that time because of his issues that he was dealing with.
I don't necessarily want to call them curses, but maybe it is generational. Some of this is, I mean, especially since we called in the spirit of our ancestors into this conversation, some of this comes back from slavery and even up into the Willie Lynch era. Some of this is even with the civil rights, post-civil rights, pre-civil rights era, where some of our ancestors, the men, I mean, could you imagine coming here from Africa, you have children, and you can't protect your children from the things that happened in slavery? Could you imagine in the time of Willie Lynch not knowing when every time your child left or went away, if they were going to be lynched or whatever because of racism and hatred and all these different things? Some of this is just generational stuff. You know, I dare to say that a lot of this didn't just happen with our grandfathers and our fathers, that it kind of, again, was a ripple effect from other things, too. So it's multiple layers to what has happened in the African-American community as it relates to father and child.
I don't hesitate at all to say that these are generational curses. Blood is real, and blood has a lot more in it than just what doctors can pick up. Blood carries memories. It carries a lot of things. And so, yes, there is something in the bloodline, as well as our history that you pointed out, that contributes to some of the things that we're talking about. I don't doubt that at all. And part of the reason and intention for having this conversation is to become conscious of that and to make another choice and create something different.
Absolutely.
As the bloodline
Absolutely.
continues. We've been talking about fathers and sons and really all the men in our families and in our lives. And I want you to listen to something that I recorded earlier today, actually about 4 o'clock this morning. And this is from my beloved James Baldwin, and a book that he wrote called Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone, which was published in 1968. I was 2 years old when this was published, and I just want you to hear this excerpt. This is a scene between 2 sons and a father. Take a listen to this.
Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone by James Baldwin. I told him to knock. And he did. And our mother opened the door. "About time," she said dryly. She was chewing on a pork chop bone and had her hair piled in a knot on the top of her head. I liked her hair that way. "You must have sat through that movie 4 or 5 times. You're going to ruin your eyes, and that'll just be too bad for you because you know we ain't got no money to be buying you no glasses. Leo, you go on inside and get ready to take your bath." "Let him come over here for a minute," said our father. He was sitting in the one easy chair near the window. He was drunk, but not as drunk as I had seen him. And this was a good mood drunk. In this mood, he would not talk about his job, or the white workers on the job, or his foreman, or about white people, or about African kings. In this mood, he talked about the islands, his mother, and father, and kinfolk, and friends, the feast days, the singing, the dancing, and the sea. I approached him, and he pulled me to him, smiling, and held me between his thighs. "How's my big man?" he asked, smiling and rubbing his hand gently and with wonder over my hair. "Did you have a good time tonight?" Khalid sat on a straight chair near him, leaning forward. "Let Leo tell you why we so late. Tell him what happened, Leo." "We were coming down the block," I began, and I watched my father's face. Suddenly, I did not want to tell him. Something in Khalib's tone had alerted him, and he watched me with a stern and frightened apprehension. My mother came and stood beside him, one hand on his shoulder. I looked at Khalib. "Maybe you could tell it better," I said. "Go on, start. I'll fill in." "We were coming down the block," I said, and I told him which block. "Coming from the movies." I looked at Khalib. "It's not the way we usually come," said Khalib. My father and I stared at each other. There was, suddenly, between us, an overwhelming sorrow. It had come from nowhere. "We got stopped by the cops," I said. Then I could not continue. I looked helplessly at Khalib, and Khalib told the story. As Khalib spoke, I watched my father's face. I don't know how to describe what I saw. I felt the one arm he had around me tighten. His lips became bitter, and his eyes grew dull. It was as though, after indescribable, nearly mortal effort, after grim years of fasting and prayer, after the loss of all he had, and after having been promised by the Almighty that he had paid the price and no more would be demanded of his soul, which was harbored now. It was as though in the midst of his joyful feasting and dancing, crowned and robed, a messenger arrived to tell him that a great error had been made and that it was all to be done again. Before his eyes then the banquet, and the banquet wines, and the banquet guests departed. The robe and crown were lifted, and he was alone then, frozen out of his dream, with all that before him which he had thought was behind him. My father looked as stunned and still and as close to madness as that, and his encircling arm began to hurt me, but I did not complain. I put my hand on his face, and he turned to me. His face changed. He smiled. He was very beautiful then, and he put his great hand on top of mine. He turned to Caleb.
Any black man who has come home and told his father that he has been stopped, he was stopped by the police, knows the look on his father's face that James Baldwin writes about in that scene. You know the look on your father's face when you have to tell him that. You see it. You see all that history you were just talking about, Brother Quasi? You see it on your father's face when you have to tell him. When I came home in 1989 and told my father that I had been pulled over by the police and that they pulled out the back seats of my car and put them on the highway in Virginia on the side of the road looking for stuff, anything. And I was telling my father this and looking at his face, you could just see the pain on his face. Not only his own memories coming up, but that his son would have to endure that same indignity just because he's a black man. And that's what he was writing about in that scene. That's what that was. And so
that
part
pain
of
has been, that pain is being manifested from his father and the father's father and all the way back to those particular times.
Indeed.
So you weren't just seeing just your father. You saw the bloodline. You saw the history of all that pain being manifested. And that's something we as men, we are not conditioned to be emotional. We are not, when women, they're allowed to express pain and grief and all the kind of stuff like that. But we men, we have to keep our emotions in check because that's what men do. And we have to keep it together. We have to be strong. And we can't let our strength be emasculated. And when we feel like our strength is being emasculated, we feel helpless. We just freeze and we just don't do anything because we're trying to hold on to what little manhood is being left with us.
I think all of that is very true, and when we come back, we're going to shift. We're going to talk about a little bit more of this brokenness, but then we're going to try to give some we're going to give some information that can help brothers be more dimensional, because tears, emotion, can free you. It's not a prison. It can free you. And in this information that I'm going to share with you, I'm going to go back into Queen Afua's book on Man Heal Thyself. She talks about it in this book, how if men cried more, they wouldn't have as much high blood pressure and heart attacks and strokes. That when you get the water flowing in your body, that's baptism. You release stuff. And so we've never been taught how to be multi-dimensional men, to be sensitive and strong. We've just been taught the strong part.
Right.
Okay? But there's that balance. There's that cosmic balance. We are out of balance as men. We're real heavy on the strong side, but weak on the sensitive side. And certain boy children, and I'm one of them, need more sensitivity that a lot of our fathers aren't equipped to provide. And for the reasons that we've been discussing, it's not their fault. It's not their fault.
Don't look for love from nobody. Find yourself to love. Find yourself to love from nobody. Find yourself to love. Know yourself. Love yourself. Find yourself to love from nobody. Find yourself to love. Love yourself.